Okay, so we're back with Thomas Taylor's dissertation on the philosophy of Aristotle. We are in the middle of a long Aristotle quote rejecting the idea of the vacuum. So we've seen some specific arguments that Aristotle offered on the other side, and then he refuted them. So I think we're still talking about the vacuum here, chapter 13. Again, however, we shall say that there is not a vacuum so separate as some assert it to be. For if there is a certain natural relation to each of the simple bodies, as for instance to fire upward, but to earth downward and toward the middle, it is evident that a vacuum will not be the cause of lation. Of what then will a vacuum be the cause? For it appears to be the cause of motion according to place, and yet is not the cause of this. So some people have said that motion requires a vacuum. He already addressed the argument where the bodies circulate out of the way of the moving object and then fill the place where the object had been, like a fish through water. And now he's saying each of the bodies is a cause of motion. The elements have their natural place where they want to be. And so what will vacuum be the cause of? And we'll look at footnote 5. For the cause of local motion is nature, but a vacuum is not nature, and therefore a vacuum is not the cause of local motion. But that nature is the cause of local motion, Aristotle clearly shows from the physical tendency of bodies. For if a tendency upward is natural to fire, but a tendency downward to earth, and a tendency to the middle elements, nature and not a vacuum is evidently the cause of local motion. Farther still, if it is anything, as for instance a place deprived of body, whither will the body placed in it be impelled? For it will not be impelled in all directions. Okay. Kind of a funny way of arguing. Like, he assumes the natural bodies have natural motions, and so a vacuum deprived of body, what's the natural motion of it? Can't move always. It's like starting from a kind of what seems to us a silly premise. Like, which direction would vacuum move? But okay. 6. Aristotle, having shown that a vacuum is not as the producing cause of motion, because the advocates for its subsistence do not introduce it as the producing cause, but as that in which, and as place, in which and through which it is necessary bodies should be moved, now very properly proceeds to show that a vacuum is neither a cause nor a concause, in the same manner as place, in which bodies that are moved are both moved and permanent. For if a vacuum is as a certain place, Aristotle, having previously assumed that it differs from place in consequence of having no body in itself, but subsisting in a privation of that of which it is the recipient, if this be the case, and if an infinite body, as they say, be placed in it, whither will it be moved? For what difference of motion will a vacuum impart, as far as a vacuum? For it will neither impart a motion upward nor a motion downward definitely. But if it is at once impelled in all directions, it will either be divulsed, or it will rather be the cause of permanency than of motion. Or rather, neither will it be the cause of permanency, for why should it rather abide in this place than in that? Aristotle employs the same argument in the third book concerning the infinite. Okay. We will keep going. The same reasoning also may be urged against those who fancy that place is something separate into which that is carried, which is borne along. For how will that which is in this be either impelled or abide? And the same reasoning will fitly accord to upward and downward, and to a vacuum. For those who say there is a vacuum make it to be place. Footnote 7. Aristotle before subverted a vacuum from its similitude to the infinite, but he now attacks it from its similitude to local interval. For the same reasoning, says he, will be adapted to those who say that place is a separate interval, as is adapted to those who introduce this void interval. For how will every natural body be impelled to such a place, or how will it remain in it? For those who say that place is the boundary of that which contains, since they do not assume this boundary as a mathematical superficies. Let me read again. Since they do not assume this boundary as a mathematical superficies, but as that which subsists in a natural body, the peculiarity of which the boundary also participates, this being the case, since bodies on high differ from those beneath, and boundaries of them are likewise different, and the natural tendencies of bodies to these are different, but interval is everywhere without difference, for in this, in what does upward differ from downward, and in what does the aptitude of fire in this differ from that of water. Okay, this is sort of interesting. So those who say that place is, as Aristotle says, the boundary of the containing medium, more or less, make it to belong to the medium in such a way that it can orient the natural motion of the bodies contained. But a blank interval is without this difference. Vacuum is without that orienting property that the boundary of the containing medium has, and connect that with the thought that was brought up before by Aristotle, kind of in this issue of like, okay, so if the place moves, is it a vessel or is it place? And then he says, so it's not just the boundary of the containing medium, which is what he gave at first. He eventually says it's the boundary of the first immovable containing medium, more or less. So then he kind of relates that to the heavens, right? That's a containing boundary of all things in the earth. So in that sense, like the connection of place to the immovable boundary does kind of orient the sense of direction in Aristotle's cosmology. So it makes sense then. Now this is of course Taylor, but it makes sense, the argument that's being given, that he's just elaborating Aristotle saying a vacuum won't give orientation to natural motion, whereas Aristotle's concept of place will, but those who posit the vacuum are effectively positing place as a pure interval, and then you can't account for natural motion or what natural motion that would have. So, but interval is everywhere without difference, for in this, in what does upward differ from downward, and in what does the aptitude of fire in this differ from that of water. Thus also in a vacuum, for a vacuum is considered as nothing else than a separate interval, in the same manner as place, according to those who assert it to be interval. If therefore local interval is not the cause of motion, it is evident that neither is a vacuum. In like manner, neither is it the cause of permanency, for why should a thing remain rather in this part of place than in this part of a vacuum? Yeah, so that's, again, the main argument here is just that a vacuum doesn't give orientation in the same way as Aristotle's definition of place, and we can't account for natural motions. How, therefore, will body be in place or in a vacuum? Of course, we would say that, well, our laws of motion, Newtonian laws, are a bit different and probably better than Aristotle's. But I don't know, maybe the flat earthers are right. Not that Aristotle's a flat earther, but they believe the earth has this kind of natural place in the center, etc. How, therefore, will body be in place or in a vacuum? For this cannot happen, since the whole of some body is considered as being in a separate and permanent place. For a part of such a body, unless it is considered separately, will not be in place, but in the whole. Now here, I'm not sure what the argument is. Since the whole of some body is considered as being in a separate and permanent place, yeah, I'm not totally clear on the argument here, but I will actually just keep going. Again, if place is not separate from body, neither will a vacuum. But to him who considers this affair, it will appear that the contrary rather happens to those who say there is a vacuum, as if this were necessary if there is motion. I mean that nothing can be moved if there is a vacuum. Okay, so others say without a vacuum, motion is impossible, Aristotle apparently here will argue that if there is a vacuum, motion is impossible. For just as those who say that the earth is at rest through similitude, so likewise it is necessary to be at rest in a vacuum, for there is not any place in it where a thing can be more or less moved, since so far as it is a vacuum, it has not any difference. Right. Well, the concept of momentum could definitely help here in accounting for natural motions in a vacuum, but he doesn't know about that, I guess. But he says that a body... No, yeah, there's no, like, intrinsic momentum, I guess. Does Aristotle have the concept of a momentum? Not sure. Anyway, that's what we would answer to his objection here. 8. Aristotle, having dissolved the arguments which appear to prove the existence of a vacuum, and having shown that a vacuum is not the cause of motion, now evinces that the contrary to what they wished happens to the authors of this hypothesis, for they fancied that local motion could not have a subsistence unless there is a vacuum, but he, on the contrary, shows that there cannot be a local motion if there is such a thing as a separate vacuum. And in the first place, he adduces an argument tending to this, that a vacuum being a thing indifferent, that which is placed in it will not be moved in one direction more than in another, and therefore, yeah, like gravity and momentum obviously would address that it will not be moved at all, but that when subsisting similarly with respect to every part of that in which it is contained, it will remain immovable, may also be inferred from what is said by Plato. Okay, so that was that bit that I didn't quite grasp when Aristotle said it up here. For this cannot happen, since the whole of some body is considered as being in a separate and permanent place. For a part of such a body, unless it is considered separately, will not be in place, but in the whole. That relation of the part to the whole, didn't connect that with the argument. So starting back here. But that, when subsisting similarly with respect to every part of that in which it is contained, okay, since it's not the superficies of the containing immovable medium, an object with regard to pure interval or pure vacuum, I guess he's assuming that, vacuum isn't like a Cartesian grid that has all the locations built in, so that whatever trajectory you take, it is defined by some like coordinate point in the vacuum. Instead, vacuum, being without stuff, is without differentiation. And so a body in an interval without stuff, the vacuum, exists with no... It exists rather similarly with respect to every part of every part of itself exists similarly with respect to the surrounding vacuum. It's a very odd thought, but I sort of get the logic of it. Not that I think it actually holds, but it will. So because vacuum is kind of undifferentiated in a certain sense, the parts of an object in a vacuum will exist with the same relation, and so there can be no impulse preferentially in any direction, so it will remain immovable. And that may be inferred from what is said by Plato in the Timaeus concerning the permanency of the earth in the middle, for he there says that a thing which subsists similarly with respect to the middle is in equilibrium. Right? That's Plato's argument for why the cosmos doesn't move, because there's no force impelling it in any direction. It just kind of sits there in the middle. So Aristotle is saying, because the void is indifferent, a similar kind of thing, it would just be a cause of permanency. But he also denies that it could be a cause of permanency, again, for an argument or for a reason that I'm not quite tracking. For if it subsists similarly with respect to every part about itself, why should it rather proceed to this part than to that, since it has an equal inclination to every part, and everything which surrounds it has on all sides a similar habitude about it? For why should it rather incline to this than to that part? If, therefore, a vacuum is entirely without any difference, it will also possess a similar habitude with respect to that which is placed in it, and that which exists in a vacuum will be similarly affected towards the whole of that in which it exists. Hence, it will be in equilibrium, and on this account will not be moved. But I'm pretty sure he did argue that it can't be like a cause of permanency either. But maybe we'll get to a reiteration of that. We'll keep going. In the first place, therefore, because every motion is either from violence or according to nature, it is necessary, if there is violent, that there should be also natural motion. Okay, so if we set up this kind of dichotomy, if they're contraries, then the existence of one implies the other. For a violent motion is contrary to nature, and that which is contrary to nature is posterior to that which is according to nature. So it's not just that they're contrary. Well, contraries for Aristotle, one member is always like the chief, just like for Pythagoreans. One member of an opposite is going to be superior, and so natural motion is superior to violent motion. So that if motion according to nature is not present with every natural body, neither will any one of the other motions be present, because its natural motion is prior. So if the contrary to natural motion is defined as a privation away from natural motion doesn't exist, but natural motion was prior, then the other motions can't subsist. Besides, how will it be natural, since there is no difference in a vacuum and the infinite? For so far as it is infinite, there will be no downward, no upward, nor middle. But so far as it is vacuum, there will be no difference between the downward and upward. For as there is no difference in nothing, so neither is there in nonentity. But a vacuum appears to be a certain nonentity and privation. Natural relation, however, is different, so that things which are naturally moved will be different. Either, therefore, I didn't realize he argues against a vacuum in this way. It's kind of interesting. Bodies have natural motion. The absence of body can't give orientation in the same way, so we can't account for motion if there is a vacuum. Kind of funny. Either, therefore, there will not be anywhere a natural relation to anything, or if there is not a vacuum. Farther still, things which are thrown are now moved. He who impels them, not touching them, either through an anti-peristasis, as some say, or because the air being impelled impels with a swifter motion than that of the lation of the impelled body, through which it tends to its proper place. But in a vacuum, there can be nothing of this kind, nor can anything be borne along unless as that which is carried. And this is a confusing sentence, we'll just read it one more time. Farther still, things which are thrown are now moved. He who impels them, not touching them, either through an anti-peristasis, 9, that is, the contest between two contrary qualities joined together. So it's moved without him touching it through an anti-peristasis, as some say, or because the air being impelled impels with a swifter motion than that of the lation of the impelled body, through which it tends to its proper place. But in a vacuum, there can be nothing of this kind, nor can anything be borne along unless as that which is carried. And definitely, I do not follow what he's trying to say. An object being thrown, they're moved. He who impels the object, not touching them. So how is it that an object... Yeah, again, the concept of momentum would obviously just cover this. So he's trying to address what momentum addresses in another way here. Through an anti-peristasis, contest between two contrary qualities joined together. I don't know how that would explain the motion of the body through air. Hopefully Taylor explains, as some say, or because the air being impelled impels with a swifter motion than that of the lation of the impelled body, through which it tends to its proper place. Okay, so we'll just read footnote 1. The design of Aristotle is now to show that if there is a vacuum, there is no such thing as violent motion, having before shown that admitting a vacuum there can be no natural motion. But since violent motion is twofold, arising either from that which compels being present and carrying or impelling or drawing it along, or from its not being present, as in things which are thrown. Aristotle frames his demonstration of the latter, omitting the former, as Alexander says, on account of its evidence. Okay, now therefore, Aristotle demonstrates that the violent motion which is produced by the absence of him who impels it cannot be produced in a vacuum. For in the throwing, which is effected in a plenum, the things thrown are moved, either by an antiperistasis of the air, which is pushed before that which is thrown by the impetus of him that throws, for the air being more easily moved than that which is thrown is pushed before it, and through violence acquiring a collected opposing force impels what is moved. Okay, so is he explaining air resistance? Or is he explaining the fact of the thing being able to be thrown out of contact with the thrower? But this taking place in a continued succession, the motion of that which is thrown remains continued until the impulse of the surrounding opposing air gradually failing, the proper motion, according to nature, of that which is thrown vanquishes the impulse of the air. So it's funny, he's referencing a mechanism kind of similar to air resistance, but then explaining that as what keeps the object moving rather than what halts the motion or impedes the motion of the object. He just doesn't have like the vector diagram right of how that contrary force collected by the air is exerted, as far as I can read it. Plato also is of this opinion, as may be seen in his Timaeus. Either, therefore, the motion of things that are thrown remains in this manner continued, or through the impulsion of the air which is violently compelled by him who throws. For in this case, so there's just no concept of momentum is the issue. For in this case, the air being more easily moved than that which is thrown, as long as it possesses power from him who throws, impels that which is thrown, there being at the same time a conflux of collected air behind it through the violence of the motion, and which co-impels until the power in it gradually failing, the natural tendency downward of the thing which is thrown subdues it. Okay, interesting. So it's actually, the case is the opposite, obviously, of what Aristotle is implying here. He's saying you couldn't explain the continued motion of a thrown object in a vacuum because the continued motion is explained by this compressed air that is brought into compression by the violence of the original motion, and that continues to impel the object. So without that, if there was no air there and it was just vacuum, then the object couldn't continue to move, which of course it could because momentum. Thus, therefore, the cause of the motion of things thrown through a plenum is assigned. But in a vacuum, neither of these can take place, for neither can there be any impulsion or surrounding opposition, since there is nothing in a vacuum. But Aristotle, having said that no one of these can exist in a vacuum, and that there can be no local motion in it, he adds, unless as that which is carried, indicating that it is impossible for that which is moved in a vacuum to be moved after the manner of throwing. If it is moved, therefore, it must be moved as things which are carried, and if it be thus moved, it must either be carried in the vacuum itself or in some body. But it is impossible for it to be carried in a vacuum, for a vacuum, since it is nothing, is inefficacious. But if there should be any body which carries in a vacuum, and carries through violence, since that which is moved also itself moves, it is evidently moved either according to nature, but it has been shown that it is impossible for anything to be naturally moved in a vacuum, or it is moved by violence. And if by violence it is either thrown, and this is impossible, or again it is moved as that which is carried, and this will be the case to infinity. Right, because the carrying thing can't be the vacuum. If it's a body, then it likewise is either carried or thrown. But since, as we have said, one thing is moved violently, viz. As that which is thrown, but another is moved in consequence of that which moves being present and employing compulsion, and this either by impelling or drawing or carrying, but carrying is more common, since to draw and to impel is after a certain manner to carry. This being the case, Aristotle adduces the instance of carrying instead of all the rest. It may, however, be said, what should hinder animals themselves from being moved according to their proper impulse in a vacuum? I was actually thinking that, right. So, animals aren't carried or thrown, they move themselves, so couldn't they move in a vacuum? And also other bodies from being moved violently, either through being impelled or drawn or carried or thrown. For it cannot be said of animals that they are definitely moved upward or downward according to nature. To this, it may be replied that the present discussion being physical, the discourse is now about natural motion, and not about that which is the effect of deliberate choice. For this latter is discussed by Aristotle in his treatise on the motion of animals. But things which are thrown, though they are thrown by animals, the mover not being continually present with them, yet possess a physical theory in consequence of being moved contrary to their proper nature. Okay, so a physical theory of the motion of animals is, I guess, not appropriate. That's addressed elsewhere. So, all right, that's just not addressed. So now we understand what was being said here. He is arguing that you need the air there to continue the motion of objects, which of course is false. Again, no one can assign a reason why that which is in motion stops somewhere. For why should it rather stop here than there? So that either it will be at rest, or it is necessary that it should be borne along to infinity, unless something more powerful impedes it. It's so funny, because he's like referencing, like, basically literally the Newtonian law of momentum, but then I guess is like adducing that as a ridiculous case because it's to infinity, and that's ridiculous. Okay, to Aristotle having before shown that if there is a vacuum, there is not motion, neither the motion which is according, nor that which is contrary to nature, now shows, says Simplicius, as it appears to me, that if there is a vacuum, not only motion is subverted, but also permanency according to nature, for natural permanencies are in the proper places of bodies, which proper places are different, but a vacuum is without difference. Why then should a thing which is moved stop here rather than there? So that if there is no difference in a vacuum, though someone should suppose bodies to be moved in it, it is therefore necessary that they should be moved to infinity, unless something more powerful impedes. And though they should be said to be at rest in a vacuum, it is necessary that they should be always at rest. For if it is natural to them to be at rest in this particular part of a vacuum, it is evidently natural to them to be similarly at rest in all its parts. Hence it will be shown that neither is it possible if there is a vacuum. Okay, so you don't have the reason for permanency or rest in any particular place in a vacuum because of the lack of difference. And then if something, if vacuum doesn't stop the object, it'll just continue to infinity. Hence it will be shown that neither is it possible if there is a vacuum for anything to stand still according to nature. For the words, quote, or it is necessary that it should be borne along to infinity are added by Aristotle as a consequent to its not standing still naturally. But if the interpreters say that this is an argument that there will not be motion according to nature in a vacuum, because things naturally moved tend to their proper place, but there is no proper place in a vacuum because it has no difference. If this be the case, it will be better to say that Aristotle, having previously subverted motion, now subverts permanency. And this, as Simplicius justly observes, appears to be more consonant to the text, since the argument thus begins, quote, again, no one can assign a reason why that which is in motion stops somewhere. Okay, so I guess there's some disputes in interpretation. Is he arguing again against natural motion? No, he's arguing against natural permanency. But Aristotle omits to investigate what that will be in a vacuum which will impede motion as being more powerful, because it is evident that it is nothing. For this thing being permanent, either according or contrary to nature, will impede, and according to nature indeed is impossible. If this also is impeded, there will be a precession to infinity. Okay. Which, of course, is not necessarily a problem. But you would need a whole different theory of physics to make sense of that. Farther still, now it seems to be carried to a vacuum because it yields. But in a vacuum, a thing of this kind is similarly every way, so that it will be every way impelled. Again, what is said will be evident from the following considerations. We see the same weight and body more. It's so funny because he's like rubbing right up against the kind of, this is how it's taught in like high school physics classes, right? Like Aristotle says that something moves and then naturally tends to stop in its proper place. Newton says it continues unless impeded, and Aristotle even directly says it will move in a vacuum unless impeded, but that's ridiculous. So he's like right up against it and just rejects it. Again, what is said will be evident from the following considerations. We see the same weight and body more swiftly borne along through two causes. Either because there is a difference in that through which it is borne along, as when it moves through water or earth or air, or because that which is borne along differs, if other things remain the same, through its excess of weight or levity. Hence, that through which it is borne along is the cause that it impedes, especially if it is borne in a contrary direction, and in the next place if it abides. But this is more especially the case with that which is not easily divided, and that which is more dense is a thing of this kind. Let the weight A, therefore, be impelled through B in the time G. Do they diagram this? No. So that's up to us to mentally diagram. Let the weight A, therefore, be impelled through B in the time G, but through D, which is more attenuated in the time E. If the length of B is equal to that of D, according to the proportion of the impeding body, for let B be water, but D air, by how much the more attenuated, therefore, and incorporeal air is than water, should be than with an A, but so much by so much swifter will A be impelled through D than through B. He gets it right there. So by how much the more attenuated, therefore, an incorporeal air is than water, by so much swifter will A be impelled through D than through B. It will therefore have the same ratio of celerity to celerity as air to water. Celerity is that swiftness or something? Celerity is usually described of like thinking. Yeah, swiftness of motion. It can also be applied to intellectual operations. It will therefore have the same ratio of celerity to celerity as air to water, so that if it is doubly more attenuated, it will pass through the space B in double the time than it will pass through D, and the time G will be double the time E. And thus always by how much the more incorporeal that is through which it passes, by how much less it impedes, and may be more easily divided. Okay, by so much the more swiftly will it be impelled. But vacuum has no ratio by which it may be surpassed by body, just as nothing has no ratio to number. For if 4 surpasses 3 by 1, but 2 by more than 1, and 1 by still more than it surpasses 2, there will no longer be any ratio by which it surpasses nothing, for it is necessary that what surpasses should be divided into excess and that which is exceeded, so that 4 will be divided into 4 and nothing. Hence, neither can a line surpass a point, unless it were composed from points, which I think Aristotle rejects. In like manner, neither can a vacuum have any ratio to a plenum, and therefore neither the motion through the one to the motion through the other. Okay. So the differential impediment imposed by different media is according to ratio. Vacuum being 0 can have no ratio. So we can't account for any natural impediment of the vacuum. 3, Aristotle here says that a magnitude by so much the more resists motion and causes motion to be slower by how much the more bulky it is and the more difficulty it is divided. He now therefore declares how far it impedes motion and how far it renders it slower, explaining the beautiful proportion between magnitudes through which motion is made and the times in which things are moved. For by how much the more gross a magnitude is, so much the more time is required that a thing may arrive at the end of that magnitude, and by how much the more subtle a magnitude is, by so much the more swiftly will a thing pass through it. There is the same ratio, therefore, between the celerity of motion through a lighter and the celerity of motion through a more gross magnitude as between a more gross and a more subtle magnitude. Thus, if water is twice as gross as air, the motion of the same weight through air will be doubly more swift than the motion through water, so that the same stone, if it consumes 6 hours in its descent through water, will consume 3 hours in a descent of the same length through air. In another group, we did Galileo's Two New Sciences, and I think he actually references this argument by Aristotle specifically and says that, it was his assumption, but it's actually false. It's not the exact ratio. It's I forget what it was or the specific context, but experiment disproved this. But when Aristotle says that air is more incorporeal than water, he means nothing more than that air less impedes than water. And he concludes in general that by how much less a body resists and by how much the more subtle it is, by so much the more swiftly is a thing moved through it. In the additional notes to Volume 5 of my translation of Aristotle's works, the reader will find what is here said illustrated by appropriate diagrams, and in like manner everything that follows when diagrams are necessary. But not in this work. No diagrams for us. Okay. But if a weight passes through so much space in such a time, through a most attenuated medium, and passing through a vacuum, it will exceed every ratio. Right, so it should move infinitely fast. Whereas really you should just say it will not be impeded at all, but it will keep the momentum that it had in the first place. For let Z be a vacuum equal to the magnitudes B and D. If therefore it passes through A and is moved in a certain time, viz. In the time E, which is less than the time F, the vacuum also will have this ratio to the plenum. Footnote 4. Aristotle, having shown through the first argument that a vacuum has no ratio to a plenum, inferred from this that if there is motion through a vacuum, an impossibility will happen about motion in time, viz. That a finite motion will be in no ratio to a finite motion, and that there will be motion which is not in time. But he now says that the motion in a vacuum will be in no ratio even to that which takes place in the most attenuated medium, because the motion through a vacuum is without time, and he adduces the absurdities which attend such an assertion. He therefore now shows what consequences will result to those who suppose a temporal motion through a vacuum and who assert that there is a ratio of the motions and times. On the contrary, it follows that there is a ratio of a vacuum to a plenum, which he has shown to be impossible, for as from there being no ratio of a vacuum to a plenum, it follows that neither is there any ratio of motions or times. So from admitting that there is a ratio of motions and times, it follows that there is a ratio of vacuum to plenum. So we've demonstrated that there's no ratio of vacuum to plenum already, so now supposing there is a ratio of motions and times, that leads to the result that there is a ratio of vacuum to plenum, which we've already disproven, so it's a reductio ad absurdum. For supposing that a motion through a vacuum is affected in a finite time, and assuming that there is the same proportion in the times of the motion and the media through which the motion passes, he collects an impossibility, viz. That a vacuum will have the same ratio to a plenum as one time to another, that is to say, a number to a number. And not only this, but a vacuum will have the same ratio to a plenum as a plenum to a plenum. Okay, so there's a reductio argument here. But in as much time as E, the weight A will pass through G, a part of D, but it will also pass through it, even if there should be something in Z differing in subtlety from air in the same proportion as the time E to the time F. For if the body in Z is as much more attenuated than D at the time E surpasses the time F, vice versa, the weight A, if it is borne along, will pass through Z with the celerity measured by the time F. If, therefore, there is no body in Z, it will pass through it with still greater celerity, but it was in the time F, so that in an equal time it will pass through both a plenum and a vacuum. This, however, is impossible. It is evident, therefore, that if there should be any time in which anything whatever is impelled through a vacuum, this impossibility would happen, for let it be assumed that anything will pass through a plenum and a vacuum in equal time, then there will be some body having the same ratio to another as time to time. And to sum up the whole in a few words, the cause of that which happens is manifest, viz., that there is a ratio of every motion to every motion, for it is in time, but there is a ratio of every time to every time, both being finite. But there is no ratio of a vacuum to a plenum. Those things, therefore, happen so far as the media differ through which they are moved. 5. Aristotle here shows the absurdities which result from supposing anything to be moved through a vacuum in time. For if there is any ratio of motion to motion and of time to time, both being finite, but there is no ratio of a vacuum to a plenum, it is evident that the motion through a vacuum will be without time. But if anyone supposes that the motion through a vacuum is in time, since time has a ratio to time, and as the times in which the motion is performed, so also the media through which the motion is effected. A vacuum also will have the ratio to a plenum, which a plenum has to a plenum, and a thing will be moved through a vacuum and through a plenum in equal time. These therefore are the consequent absurdities. Okay. But these according to the excess of things which are moved. For we see that things which have a greater momentum, either of weight or levity, if in other respects, so this is not the same concept of, because momentum is what would save all of these misconceptions. But these according to the excess of things which are moved. For we see that things which have a greater momentum, either of weight or levity, if in other respects possess similar figures, are more swiftly carried through an equal space, and that according to the ratio which the magnitudes have to each other. So momentum is related to mass here, but it's not. I don't know what the error is precisely. I don't know if this is the same concept of momentum that we're familiar with, per se. But, okay. To read the sentence again. For we see that things which have a greater momentum, either of weight or levity. So I guess, does he imply then that like fire has a greater tendency upward and earth has a greater tendency downward? So greater momentum is not linked directly to mass, because things that are less massive have a greater momentum, so to speak, upward for Aristotle. Things that have a greater mass have a greater momentum, so to speak, downward. I think that's the meaning. If in other respects they possess similar figures, they are moved, or they are more swiftly carried through an equal space. So yeah, lighter things move upward faster, heavier things move downward faster, and that according to the ratio which the magnitudes have to each other. So fire moves upward as much faster than air, as fire is lighter than air, so that this also will be the case in passing through a vacuum. But this is impossible, for through what cause will it be more swiftly impelled? Right, because the levity or gravity of the object is moved in a particular direction because of the natural place of those objects for Aristotle. For in a plenum, this necessarily happens, since that which is greater more swiftly divides by its force, and that which is borne along or thrown either divides by its figure or by the momentum which it possesses. All things, therefore, will be moved with equal swiftness, but this is impossible. From what has been said, therefore, it is evident that if there is a vacuum, the contrary will happen to that through which those who say there is a vacuum endeavors to prove its existence. For these fancy there is a vacuum separate and per se, if there is motion according to place, but this is just the same as to say that there is a certain separate place, and that this is impossible has already been shown. To those that also who consider the affair by itself, it will appear that what is called a vacuum is truly a vacuum, for just as if any one puts a cube into water, as much water will give way as is equal to the cube. The like also happens in air, though it is immanifest to sense. Hence, in every body which may be transferred, so far as it is naturally adapted to be transferred, it is necessary, unless it is compressed, that it should be transferred either always downward, if its lation is downward, as earth, or upward, if it is fire, or towards both, as air, or of whatever kind the thing may be, which is locally situated. In a vacuum, however, this is impossible, for neither is it a body. But through the cube, an equal interval may appear to permeate, which was before in a vacuum, just as if neither the water nor the air should yield to the wooden cube, but should permeate it throughout. The cube, however, has as much magnitude as the vacuum contains, which, if it should also be hot or cold, or heavy or light, would be no less, but would even be more essentially different from all passive qualities, although it is not separate from them. I mean the bulk of the wooden cube, so that though it should be separated from all other things, and should neither be heavy nor light, yet it would occupy an equal vacuum, and would be in the same part of a place and a vacuum equal to itself. In what, therefore, will the body of the cube differ from an equal vacuum and place? If there are two of this kind, why will not also anything whatever be in the same thing? This, therefore, is one absurdity and impossibility. Okay. Footnote 6. That was very obscure, that passage we just read, so hopefully Taylor clarifies it. There is a great order of doctrine here, says Simplicius. For Aristotle first dissolved the arguments which appear to establish a vacuum. Afterwards, he shows that a vacuum is not the cause of motion, and that on this account it has no subsistence, if through this it is assumed, and then he turns the argument to the very contrary. For since they say, if there is motion, there is a vacuum, he shows by many arguments that if there is a vacuum, there is not motion. In the next place, here proposing the problem by itself, he demonstrates that there is not a vacuum, again deducing the reasoning to an impossibility, i.e., that body will pervade through body if there is a vacuum, to avoid which consequence they suppose a vacuum. For when one body is placed in another, as for instance a wooden cube in water or air, it is necessary that what was previously inherent should give place to that which enters, and should either depart upward if fire, or downward if earth, or into that which is between, if it is any one of the middle elements. It is also necessary that so much should depart as is equal to the bulk of that which is introduced. This indeed is immediately evident in some things, as in a wooden cube placed in a vessel of water, for a quantity of water flows over equal to the bulk of the cube. But in some things this receding is not evident to sense. It may, however, Simplicius adds, be apprehended from certain machines, for in hydraulic organs, when, being full of air, water is poured into them, certain tongues being added to the cavities of the trumpets or pipes through which the wind makes its egress, they infer from the sound the egress of the air through these cavities. But if the body which was previously inherent has no egress whatever, and another is compelled to enter, that which was previously inherent is either compressed into itself, and being contracted is condensed, so as that... Okay, I'm not following anymore. Start back here. But if the body which was previously inherent has no egress whatever, and another is compelled to enter, that which was previously inherent is either compressed into itself, as being contracted is condensed, so as that the vessel may receive as much of the body which is introduced as the compression had contracted of the first body, or the vessel will burst rather than receive the other body. These things, therefore, being thus obviously apparent, what shall we say happens in a vacuum when any body is placed in it? Shall we say that an equal bulk of the vacuum will recede? But this is ridiculous, if that which is impossible can be said to be ridiculous, for that which recedes has a being. Will it therefore abide? An equal interval of the vacuum, therefore, will pervade through the cube. Okay, yeah, treating the vacuum as a substance, we run into this problem. Hence, if a vacuum is entirely nothing, we have the object of our investigation. We've proved that it doesn't exist then. But if it possesses a certain nature triply divided, how will it pervade through another triply extended interval? So if vacuum is a thing extended through 3 dimensions, how can it be in the same place as the cube, which occupies it? Well, if you have like that notion of space as like a background grid that bodies move through, doesn't obviously become an issue, but Aristotle supposedly already addressed that issue in treating place and space as dependent on body. For this is just as absurd as if water, not departing from the vessel that contains it, should proceed through a stone cube. For why should these be prevented from proceeding through each other, but a vacuum not? Okay. Shall we say that these are hot or white or heavy, or are replete with certain other passive qualities which happen to them, but that a vacuum is deprived of these? To assert this, however, would be absurd, for it has been before shown that bodies exist in place according to intervals alone, through which also, being distant by parts, they require position, for though intervals are inseparable from other accidents, yet their existence, so far as intervals, which definition is naturally adapted to separate, is different. A stone, therefore, does not occupy so much place because it is white or black or heavy, but because its interval is so much, though through its gravity it tends to this place. But when it is in place according to bulk, for to this alone, among the things belonging to the cube, the magnitude of place is consequent. Hence, though a stone cube should be supposed, all other accidents being separated from it, to be an interval alone, it would nevertheless occupy a space equal to that which it occupied in conjunction with other passive qualities. In what, therefore, will the interval of a cube differ from that of an equal vacuum and place? If two such are in the same thing, why may there not be many and infinite? By collecting, therefore, what has been said, we may see the necessity of the demonstration. For if body is in a vacuum, interval will be in interval, bulk in bulk, and body in bodies. For nothing hinders the other accidents of body, since they are incorporeal, from pervading through each other. If, therefore, it is impossible for body to be in body, it is also impossible for it to be in a vacuum. But Aristotle says that what is called a vacuum is truly a vacuum, because it affords no utility whatever. Okay. Picking up, farther still, it is evident that the cube, when transferred to another place, will have this, a triple dimension, which all other bodies have. So that if it in no respect differs from place, why is it necessary to make a place for bodies beside the bulk of each, if bulk is impassive? For it contributes nothing, if another equal interval of this kind should be about it. Again, it is necessary that the quality of the vacuum, which is in things that are moved, should be manifest. But now it nowhere appears within the world, for air is something, but it does not seem to be a body. Neither would water appear to be a body if fishes were made of iron, for the judgment of that which is tangible is by the touch. Hence, therefore, it is manifest that there is not a separate vacuum. And we're not going to dig too much deeper into this. I think there are several problems going on here, but let's not spend a huge amount of time on it. Footnote 7, and then we'll be done. Aristotle adds this second argument tending to the same thing. For if in every body, the interval being separate by definition from the passive qualities, i.e. from the accidents, differs in no respect from a vacuum, and bodies when moved and transferred are moved together with their proper intervals, why are other intervals of the like kind necessary to bodies? So the vacuum's just kind of redundant. For if each, so far as it possesses interval, requires another interval, a vacuum also will require another interval, and that another, and thus we shall proceed to infinity. Okay. All right, then. Yeah, the notion of like absolute space would challenge some of these contentions, but Aristotle supposedly has already kind of proven that space and place is dependent on body. So we will just kind of move on from here next time. And we're still addressing the vacuum question. So that'll be tomorrow, chapter 14. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest.